We're now at Little Round Top, one of the iconic locations on the Gettysburg battlefield. For over 90 minutes here on the afternoon of July 2nd, 1863, Union and Confederate soldiers would battle for control of the hill in some of the most famous fighting of the entire Battle of Gettysburg. But the story of the Battle of Little Round Top actually begins on the morning of July 2nd, 1863, as the Union position south of the town of Gettysburg began to solidify and take shape. Union troops occupied Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill and most of Cemetery Ridge, which you can see in the valley behind me, dotted and lined with monuments today. It'd be the responsibility of the 3rd Army Corps of the Union Army of the Potomac, led by Major General Daniel Edgar Sickles, to continue the Union battle line south on Cemetery Ridge and to cover Little Round Top. But Daniel Sickles, who's not a professional soldier, he's a political general, Daniel Sickles doesn't like the ground he's been assigned to hold. Sure, Little Round Top is high, and you can see for miles, but it's also very rocky, difficult to move artillery and ammunition up to the summit. Furthermore, his position below the hill on Cemetery Ridge is confronted with trees, making it very difficult for Sickles to see any enemy moving towards his position. A little after noon on July 2nd, 1863, Sickles, without alerting George Meade, without asking for permission, would advance his command further to the west to occupy high ground along the Emmitsburg Road and the Peach Orchard, leaving no one on Little Round Top. George Gordon Meade, commander of the Union Army, unaware of the situation, will dispatch the chief engineer of the Union Army, Gouverneur K. Warren, to Little Round Top to survey the situation and find out what in the world is going on here on the left flank of the Union Army. Warren is shocked when he arrives here on the summit of Little Round Top to find no one, with the exception of a small Union signal station communicating via semaphore with the rest of the Union Army below. And at almost the exact same moment, Gouverneur Warren spies, moving towards Little Round Top, Confederates. The battle for July 2nd is about to begin. The story of the fighting here on Little Round Top really turns into a race. Who's going to get here first? Those Confederates already moving towards the hill, or whatever Union reinforcements Gouverneur Warren can find and race to the summit? Let's head to our next stop to find out what happens. We've now moved to the southern slopes of Little Round Top. And where we left off, Gouverneur Warren has discovered Confederates advancing towards the undefended hill, and he needs to find men to rush to the summit. The first Union troops to arrive on the hill are a brigade of 1,300 men from Maine, New York, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, led by a young colonel from Erie, Pennsylvania named Strong Vincent. Vincent, seeing the emergency, seeing that if the Union Army doesn't control Little Round Top, disaster could befall the entire Union force at Gettysburg, will rush his men to the hill, and they arrive only moments before Confederates advance from the tree line behind you or behind the camera on the shoulder of Big Round Top. Now, Vincent doesn't deploy his men on the summit of the hill. Rather, he deploys them close to where we're standing now, on this shelf that runs along the southern face of the hill. And you'll notice when you visit Little Round Top that rock walls, breastworks have been piled up all around the hill. These weren't here when the actual fighting took place because Vincent's men didn't have time to build them up. Again, they were only here about 5 minutes before Confederates advance towards the hill itself. Vincent's men will rise up, lower their rifles, open fire, and the battle for Little Round Top will begin. A lot of the Confederates that are actually attacking the hill are these men from Alabama and Texas, men who have been up all day, who are already physically exhausted. And when they emerge from the trees, to them they don't see a hill, they see a mountain crowned with fire. But at least 3 times they surge up the slopes of the hill, each time driving back, bit by bit, elements of Vincent's battle line. At one point, Vincent's line, particularly here, near the monument to the 16th Michigan, begins to fall apart, and Vincent himself will rush to the threatened point of the line. He doesn't have a sword with him that day, but he does have his wife's riding crop. He mounts a boulder just behind me, waves his wife's riding crop in the air, and shouts out to his men, "Don't give an inch." Only a moment later, he's mortally wounded by a Confederate bullet. Meanwhile, Gouverneur Warren, chief engineer of the Union Army, is still struggling to find men to defend the hill. He runs into the 140th New York, commanded by Colonel Patrick O'Rourke, a man that Warren knows. And now he'll order O'Rourke to lead his men to the summit of the hill. O'Rourke will arrive right behind me, not far from where the castle monument is today, just in time to see these Alabamans and Texans literally gaining the crest of the hill. And one man would later say the men of the 140th New York drove back the Confederates by the very weight of their bodies. But it would cost that young Colonel Patrick O'Rourke his life. He was killed on the slopes of Little Round Top, one of many Union officers who will die in the fighting for this hill. Thanks to the quick work of Vincent, O'Rourke, and Warren, the right end, where we are on Little Round Top, is secure. It was a completely different story on the left end of Vincent's line, on the rear slope of the hill, where a colonel named Joshua Chamberlain would lead 350 men from Maine into battle. And that'll be our next stop. We've left the main summit of Little Round Top behind, and now we've traveled to the rear slope of the hill on a small ridge better known today as Vincent's Spur. And it would be on this little spur that the 350 men of the 20th Maine would be positioned at about 5 o'clock on the afternoon of July 2nd, 1863. Their commanding officer was a colonel by the name of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. He was a college professor turned soldier, and this would be Chamberlain's first real test as commander of the men of the 20th Maine. Chamberlain is positioned here and told by Strong Vincent, his commanding officer, two things. One, that he's the left flank of the left end of the Union line, which means his left end is vulnerable. There's no one out there to help him out. And two, that no matter what happens, no matter what surges towards the spur, no matter what emerges from the woods below, he can't abandon his position. He can't leave the hill. And then Vincent would disappear and Chamberlain would be on his own. Only a few moments later, the men of the 47th and 15th Alabama would emerge from the woods on Big Round Top at the base of Little Round Top and begin their attack against Chamberlain's position. After about 30 minutes of heavy fighting, the air was thick with smoke, so thick that it was very difficult to see any great distance. And the roar of battle drowned out even the loudest of conversations. And as Chamberlain is standing behind his battle line, he's alerted to a threat off to his left, his exposed left flank. And Chamberlain would later write that he mounted a boulder, peered beneath the smoke, and what he saw was his worst nightmare coming to life. The men of the 15th Alabama, discovering his vulnerable left flank, were moving around his position. Now, in the heat of battle, Chamberlain was forced to pull back the left wing of his line, refuse his battle line, so now the men of the 20th Maine faced in two directions to counter this new threat. After about 90 minutes of heavy fighting, the men of the 20th Maine are running out of ammunition. Casualties are mounting, and Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain thinks that one more Confederate assault will drive him off the hill. And what is he to do? Well, Chamberlain, believing he had no other option, would order the bayonet. And Chamberlain would later write that that one order swept down the battle line like a wildfire. And then, almost spontaneously, the remaining survivors of the 20th Maine would charge down the slopes of Little Round Top to the Confederates below. William C. Oakes, commander of the 15th Alabama, would later write his men ran like a herd of wild cattle. Chamberlain and the men of the 20th Maine captured hundreds of prisoners and cleared Little Round Top, at least this portion of it, of Confederates. After 90 minutes, the fighting on Little Round Top came to an end. Over 1,000 men were numbered among the casualties, men killed, wounded, missing, captured. Thanks to a heroic Union defense and the skillful leadership of men like Patrick O'Rourke, Gouverneur Warren, Strong Vincent, and Joshua Chamberlain, the Union Army was able to hold on to this strategic position. But just as the fighting at Little Round Top is dying down, it's picking up and growing in intensity just west of Little Round Top. So join me now as we head to our next stop on this virtual tour of the Gettysburg battlefield, the Wheat Field.